when you're driving around and you see a gas station that has gas for $2 a gallon. Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a model showcase video for this 1/35th scale German Panzer 38T ausf.S with the single fuel drum trailer. The model in this video is built for my own personal collection and it's not for sale and or purchase. However, like I often mention in these build videos, I frequently take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35th scale and 1/6 scale. For availability and pricing information, that information would be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@EastCoastArmory.com. This model here is built predominantly out of the box. However, I went ahead and added some aftermarket parts to enhance it, bringing it to the condition that we have here. In this video, I'm going to be going over the entire build, as well as giving this model a thorough in-box review. So stay tuned because there's going to be a lot of info coming at you, because this build here isn't as simple as it looks. To start this video off, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. And this vehicle here is the German Panzerkampfwagen 38T, or the Panzer 38T. This particular example is the S model, and what makes this one even more unique is that hooked up to the rear section is the extended range single fuel drum trailer. One interesting thing about the 38T is that unlike the other German vehicles like the Panzer I, II, the Panther, the Tiger, and all of those wonderful vehicles, is that those vehicles are German in their origin. However, the 38T family is actually not. The 38T is a Czechoslovakian tank design that was produced in Czechoslovakia for the Czech military in the 1930s. When this vehicle was first adopted, it was known as the CKD LT VZ38. The company who actually designed and produced these vehicles in Czechoslovakia was the firm CKD. CKD is an abbreviation for a really long name that unfortunately I cannot pronounce since I don't speak the Czech language. However, this was the largest engineering firm in the country at that time and were responsible for designing and producing lots of large civil equipment such as locomotives, trams, and for the purposes of this video, the 38T tank. The 38T was a light tank that had a crew of 4, and the entire vehicle was comprised of rolled steel and riveted construction. Of course, for the 1930s, this was something that wasn't out of place and was pretty much quite standard for light tanks and other vehicles similar to this at that time. The vehicle came in at about 10 tons and was propelled by a single 6-cylinder Praga Type TN HPS gasoline engine. The vehicle was able to hit a maximum speed of about 26 miles an hour on-road and about 9 miles an hour off-road. The vehicle suspension consisted of a leaf spring design, and each side consisted of 2 of these large leaf springs, each of those holding onto 2 wheels found on swing arms. The vehicle would have this iconic look of these 4 large road wheels present on each side of the vehicle. For the armament, the vehicle would have utilized a single 37mm KWK 38T L47. For the secondary armament, the vehicle utilized 2 7.92mm ZB58 MGs. The ZB53s were basically the type of MG that was utilized by the Czech military at this time and was used on not just their vehicles but also on infantry mounts as well. The vehicles themselves were designed in 1937 to the 1938 timeframe, where they were presented to the Czech military, who did some testing on them and gave them the seal of approval. The vehicles were going to go into full production and were going to be adopted and fielded by the Czech military. However, shortly after this decision came through, Czechoslovakia itself was basically annexed by Germany, and at this time the Germans went ahead and looked at the tanks and tested them themselves, to which the Germans were impressed with them. They really liked the design and they liked the capabilities that this vehicle offered. So much so that even under German occupation, the 38T remained in production, only this time once completed, instead of going to the Czech military, it went straight to the Wehrmacht. While under German occupation, about 1,400 units were produced in total. The vehicles were in production from 1939 all the way up until 1942, where at this point here, the 38T's design was starting to show its age and was increasingly becoming ever more antiquated. However, the story of the 38T doesn't end right there. Although the vehicle in its tank format was becoming antiquated, the suspension and the drivetrain of the vehicle was still a valid, well-designed setup and can be recycled and used for other purposes, and that's exactly what the Germans went ahead and did. The 38T's strongest attributes was it had a really reliable engine, the transmission was nicely designed, and the suspension was good and durable. On top of that, the production lines were already ironed out, and the tooling was ready to go to produce as many units as they desired. The only thing that needed to change was really the superstructure. With the 38T chassis and platform, they were able to develop anti-tank versions, which of course were the Martyrs, and there were several variants of the Martyr. They have a flak variant, they have a self-propelled howitzer variant, and of course the most famous version of the 38T family is none other than the Hetzer. One final note to mention is that the Swedes in the post-war years would use the 38T platform as a basis to develop a fully tracked, light armored personnel carrier. This vehicle served with the Swedish military up until the early 1970s, which is very impressive for a vehicle that was designed all the way back in the late 1930s. Before we go any further with the video, let's go ahead and take a step back to when this model was first started in order to get a good idea on what the base starter kit supplies you with. And here's the model at the start of the project. For the base starter kit, I'll be utilizing this Dragon 1/35 scale Panzerkampfwagen 38T ausf.S kit with the fuel trailer. Now, this kit here was released back in 2012, more specifically the unit with the addition of the fuel trailer. Dragon has been making renditions of the 38T chassis all the way up from its founding from the early 1990s. Throughout the 90s and even into the 2000s, the 38T chassis was frequently reused on several other different renditions of this vehicle, which were released as kits by Dragon. However, in 2007, the unit was completely retooled, and that's the genesis of the tooling that's found on this kit here. I don't believe any of the tooling found on the older kits is supplied with this kit release that we have here. And all of the kits post 2007 utilize the same tooling found on this release. This model here is a very recent addition to the stash, and is one that I went out of my way actually to source and track down. Not necessarily for the tank itself, but more importantly, for the fuel trailer. If anyone is a frequent viewer of the ECA channel and keeps up with my 1/6 scale tank builds, this unit here should look very familiar because I recently released this as a 1/6 scale full 3D printed kit. Information on that unit is found on the ECA channel as well as also on the eastcoastarmory.com website. Well, when I was designing that particular kit, I needed this unit here as a builder's aid to help me scale the unit up to 1/6 scale. And also in order to get everything in the right proportions. And that was why I needed to trace this kit down. These kits here are somewhat common. They can be found on online retailers, as well as also you might be able to snag one in a local hobby shop if they carry a wide range of the Dragon kits. These kits, again, have been out of production for, it's funny to say, about 10 years or so now, but again, Dragon's distribution system is pretty good. This one here I was able to track off of eBay, and the price I paid was roughly about $30, which is generally the going rate for these current generation of Dragon kits. Starting with the model's graphic design brings us to the box art. Here we have the 38T in the foreground, hitched up with its fuel trailer. In the background, we have a smoldering Russian armor car. The composition itself is nicely laid out and is actually nicely rendered. The illustrator did a nice job with all the fine detailing found on both the foreground vehicles as well as also with the burning vehicle in the background. The illustrator's name is right over here, hidden in the mud. Now, this illustrator, I don't believe I've seen any of his works before on other Dragon kits, as Dragon generally, like with most model companies, utilize a group of artists that they rotate in and out for the various works that are required. From the box art brings us to the rest of the graphic design. This is typical for the 39 to 45 series, only with this one being a smart kit, the banner is in yellow, and with the basic Dragon type typography. Of course, the logo. On the side, we have a nice little color chart showing the vehicle with the trailer hitched, and as well as also the type of markings that are supplied with the model. In the green here, we have the usual corporate info. The green continues throughout the sides with, again, the box art. And on the sides here, we have some of the features that are supplied with this kit, illustrated with the CAD drawings. Being a smart kit, this model does have a lot of nice features that are supplied with it. All the features are actually continued on the back panel, which is typical, again, for Dragon kits of the more contemporary period. You can see with all of these features that are found on this model, Dragon really put a lot of time and effort with the development of this kit. One of the features that stood out to me was over here with the model's tin work. They went ahead and also incorporated the sagging fatigued metal sections, which would be found on the real 38T. This is a very nice touch and definitely shows, again, the type of attention to detail that Dragon implemented when doing the engineering for this model here. Cracking open the box, we'll reveal the contents. And as one can clearly see, even though it's a 38T, this model does feature quite a handful of components, which we'll be going over. At quick glance, you'll notice that the type of plastic quality is the standard polystyrene, which is used on current generation of Dragon kits, which is that dull matte type finish, and does have some very nice detailing represented in it. This runner here is actually probably, for me, the most important runner of this entire kit, and that's the trailer. You'll notice that this kit does supply you with two options. The first is the double fuel drum variant, and the kit also features the single fuel drum variant. Here we have the actual fuel drums with their faceplates, and yes, the information is integrally found molded into the tooling. This runner here apparently is lifted off of a Panzer IV variant, which they, again, offered. And here on the back section, we have some sections for the 38T. Obviously, the tin work, like I was mentioning before, as well as several other hull sections. Of course, with this kit being full interior, you can see the other interior detailing is found molded on the inside portions of the plates. Beneath that, we also have the suspension, which you could probably make out from the parts bag. Here you can see the type of detailing molded into one of the road wheels. Nice crisp detailing is found, as well as also the type of detailing found on the rear idlers. Digging further in the box takes us to this little runner here, which appears to have the radiator and the air blower, as well as a few other automotive bits like the timing gear, and that looks like a jack. On this side here, we have the Pioneer tools. Again, very nicely represented and nicely detailed. Digging down further, this looks like the ammo racks and the internal magazines. Note the corrugations and the perforations found on these plates here. Another runner, this is of the single fuel drum trailer, which is definitely kind of becoming handy for me. And this runner here, it looks like to be the bulk of the interior components. This is the transmission. Note the very nicely detailed and crisp sections that are integrally molded in. The radio, again, nicely rendered out. This looks like the engine block. And these, I believe, are actually the control levers for the driver, and are the steering clutches. This is definitely not a simplistic kit by any stretch of the imagination. Digging further down gives us even more components. Obviously, this kit will feature a lot of parts that will not be utilized for this rendition. And this is one of those Dragon kits where you will have an abundance of spare parts to clutter up your spare bin. Just like with a lot of Dragon kits, the photo etch is found on this little paper insert. Here we have the clear sections that are molded in clear plastic. Obviously, these would include parts like the periscopes and headlights, visors, things like that. We have a little bit of tow cable and a little piece of yarn, which is to be utilized for the fuel line that runs from the barrel into the fuel tank of the model. It's an interesting choice that they went with a cloth type length of string as opposed to something like a rubber tube. But I guess the fuel lines were probably braided, so it makes sense. And here we have the PE. Nicely rendered out. You can see the details on the fasteners that are integrally etched in. And they even went so far as to make that little perforated bin that's found on the side of the vehicle with the photo etch, which will definitely make for a very nice, crisp final appearance. As well as even the grill work is also PE. Again, a very nice choice of material. Decal sheet, standard blue paper water slide type, and I've had no problems with Dragon details in the past, and I'm pretty sure these ones here should give me no problems either. And to the largest sections on this entire model is the hull. Note, it is a one-piece assembly that has both good exterior and interior detailing as well, found on the sidewalls. Probably slide molding was utilized for this type of procedure. And here we have the turret. No interior detailing is found on the sides that are integrally molded in, but the exterior detailing does look to be very nicely done with its rivet detailing present. Digging down deeper brings us to the tank's tracks. Now this is one part of the build that I'm definitely not going to be a fan of. And this model does utilize individual link and link track, which is their magic track type system. And I'm not really going to go over it as I'm not going to be utilizing this for this build. And I will be outsourcing that and replacing it with some kind of an aftermarket source. More information on that is to come. Going down deeper now brings us to the instructions. Now, obviously, like I said before, a lot of sections of this build are not going to be used. Opening up the instructions themselves, you can see that the quality is typical for Dragon, with their sections all done in CAD. And generally, I've had some very good results with this type of a series from Dragon. However, there have been some errors that I've found on several other Dragon kits in the past. And of course, if I encounter any, I will definitely point them out in the build section of this video. So definitely stay tuned for that. It looks like over here we have a little correction, an addendum of some other options that this kit does have. And again, definitely something that is good to know. And here's the model with its interior fully completed, and at this point here I can seal it up and progress with the remainder of the external detailing. Of course, I'm periodically taking a break from the build to showcase all of this detailing at the time, because once the vehicle gets fully assembled and progresses past this point, getting access to the interior is going to be very difficult, if not impossible in some cases. So, in true ECA video fashion, let's go ahead and go over all of the interior detailing here now that I have the perfect opportunity to do so. So like what was showcased earlier, this kit's interior is a big portion of the kit, and the detailing for the interior components are exquisitely detailed, and there are a ton of details that need to be pumped into this model in order to bring it up to the condition that we see it here. The way you see it, however, is all out of the box, and zero aftermarket components were utilized at this point. Starting with the engine, here you get to see what it looks like secured in place in the engine bay. Now, prior to mounting it in place, I actually went ahead and took photographs of it separately once I finished completing all of the engine's assembly. The engine, just like with several of the other components found on the interior, are comprising of several sub-assemblies that all get assembled together into the completed unit. Because of this assembly method, these components are going to have the byproduct of being very detailed. It also has the byproduct of adding a little bit more complexity to some of the components I'm going to be touching on in a second, but the piece's detail fidelity is going to be off the charts. On the engine itself, the model even has the little sediment filter, which is found on the lower portion of the engine block. If anyone is a fan of the channel and have seen the 1/6 scale Maybach engines that I frequently make videos on, you'll know that these engines here have a little glass jar that's a sediment filter. The sediment filter detailing is present on this kit, albeit it's molded in opaque plastic. In order to go ahead and give the illusion of it being glass, this is facilitated with a few different shades of gloss paint as well as lacquer. If you apply it in a certain manner, this will give a nice little sheen and glossiness to it that'll give the illusion that the piece is made from a transparent type material. Albeit it's full with some kind of a fuel in it, but you can still get that sheen nonetheless. It's still better than overpainting it silver or flat black, which a lot of individuals out there tend to do. Several of the other components consist of the carburetor, the generator, as well as the starter. All of these pieces of equipment, again, are supplied with the kit and are very nicely detailed. In order to really make them shine further, all you need to do is paint them with their appropriate colors. And this is where I've seen a lot of people make mistakes on the internet, not just with this particular build, but with many other models out there with interiors. They don't really understand how to paint these engines. For this particular model, I went ahead and did some research with a simple Google search. I found a Hetzer that was in the process of being restored, and they completed the engine. And that basically was the photograph that I use as reference for painting the model here. The engine block itself is painted with gray, and the top portion here, the pan itself, is painted with black. The remainder of the weathering just gets applied, giving you the look that you see here. In addition to the engine, you can see the radiator, as well as even the little blower fan detailing. Might not be coming out on camera, but inside this cowling over here is the little impeller that's used to blow the air that passes through the radiator. On the topic of the radiator, that too is present and is nicely detailed. Outside of the radiator, the remainder of the interior details are as follows. We have some fuel tanks. We even have the battery tray that's found right here. What's unique about the battery tray, as well as a few other details on this model, is that it requires the builder to utilize some photo etch parts. Of course, the PE is supplied. However, on some aspects of the build, the PE is optional, like with the front driver sticks that we have on the transmission. But for other locations, like on the battery tray itself, these components are absolutely required and are mandatory to be assembled by the builder in order just to get the piece mounted in place. One other bit of detailing that is kit supplied involves the battery tray lid. The lid is comprised exclusively from photo etch components, and it's 2 or 3 parts that get glued together by the builder, as well as bent to shape to form the shape of the component. The piece is very nicely detailed. However, it's currently not fitted to the battery at this point, but this is something I'm going to be mounting shortly after the filming of this take. Aside from the battery, we have this little box over here, and on top of the box we have some little tools. The tools are kit supplied, and on the real vehicle would, I believe, mount to the locations that we see. We have a grease gun, some kind of a wrench, and I believe some other type of oiler. The details are just simply painted to resemble brass, as many of these types of equipment would have been made in this material back in the day. And again, it's just a nice quick way to further enhance the model, as opposed to just leaving everything oversprayed or painted with some other type of color. On that topic, that brings us to the interior color itself. The entire model's interior is red oxide primer. This is from a few real examples that I've seen of surviving 38Ts, and I just basically mirrored those real vehicles on this model here. When it comes to German interior colors, I may be mistaken on the 38T, but for others, we had red oxide primer. There was also a dark gray, and several other vehicles would have had that cream color, which is typically found in vehicles like the Tiger or the Panther. For the 38Ts, I'm not really sure if they would have ever received those colors, but this is something that would be best left up for the builder to do a little bit more research on if they want to go down that path. For this one here, the red oxide is obviously the route I took. With the color out of the way, this takes us to the transmission. The transmission is all out of the box, and it is exquisitely rendered, just like with the engine itself. One interesting feature about this kit is with the steering stalks. You have an option between two methods. You have one that's all made from injection molded plastic, which is basically ready to go out of the box, or you can go the hard mode route, where you can fabricate every single one of these little bits of detailing here with their spacers by utilizing exclusively the kit supply photo etch. For this one here, I went with the easier option by going with the plastic route, which, by the way, in its own right is perfectly adequate for the job at hand. But if you want to be bold and live on the wild side, by all means, go ahead and go with the photo etch method. If/when you screw it up, rest assured it's okay, because you could just drop the plastic one in place and call it a day. From the transmission bounces to the seats, nothing much to talk about here. These are the kit supply parts, simply painted and mounted in place. When you paint the seats, be sure not to accidentally paint the frames on the back ends over there as the seat pads. And this is a very simple way to improve the look of your interior builds overall. The pads themselves were simply painted and weathered to the condition that you see here, and then just mounted directly in place. Directly next to the assistant driver is the vehicle's radio box. The radios are very, very nicely detailed, and these are 100% kit supplied, no mods or changes that were made. One thing about the radios, in order to really make them pop, you really need to paint them in a certain manner. And fortunately, there are a lot of resources out there online for free that have the photographs of the real radios, and there not only do you get to see the colors, but you also get to see what all those little knobs and switches do, and because of that, you'll know exactly how to paint them. In addition to the knobs, there are also a few little, I believe, gauges on the real ones, and in order to replicate the gauge, I went with some white, and then I went over all those white areas once dry with some gloss lacquer, giving you the look that you see here. Once everything is painted and weathered, it really does do an excellent job with rendering out the molded details on the radio. From the radio, this now takes to the internal magazines, and this vehicle has a lot of internal magazines for the main ammunition. The ammo racks are found strewn around here on the lower hull, but there's also several mounted inside of the turret, which I'll touch upon in a moment. Unfortunately, it's probably really tricky to get on screen, but here I have a spare ammunition box holder with the ammunition box present. As you can see, the ammo can itself is integrally molded to the cage, which would be part of the vehicle, and it's basically what the ammo cans slide into. When you're painting this, in order to really get the illusion that the cage is just a perforated metal plate, you need to paint the color of the ammo cans through these little dots that are integrally molded on. You can do this one of two ways. You can either take a fine point paintbrush and meticulously paint every single one of these holes and do that to either side, to which then, if you still have your sanity at the end, congratulations. Or you could do it a easier route, where you just take a broad stroke of paint that's the main color that's using for the ammo can, you smear it on this location, and basically you just wipe it off with your finger or with a rag of some sort. That will have the effect of having the paint only inside of the little sunken areas, and the areas above that will be wiped off, giving you the appearance that we have here. Obviously, doing this is a nice way, and a rather simple way, to improving the look of one of your builds that have this type of a setup present. On the inside, we have some more details, namely ammo cans of two flavors. These ones, too, also have that little cage system that I was touching upon before, and were painted in the same format. Then there's a few other details found on the inside, and this is where I found the kit to be a little, not tricky, but it is something to look out for. The kit does have several indication points where these items get mounted in place. However, they are more or less suggestions as opposed to the exact point where the parts need to go. If you're trying to build a kit out of the box, you're going to find that you're going to be running into issues where the parts are not going to fit into the allocated locations that are suggested on the molded sections. So you are going to have to fudge things here or there just to get everything mounted into their appropriate locations. It's nothing that's too serious, but it is something to watch out for if you're tackling one of these builds for the first time. This leads us to the side visor here. This is actually a multi-component piece, and what's nice is it has a clear plastic insert for the prism. The same type of detailing is going to be present on a few of the other interior parts I'm going to be touching upon in a moment. Overall, bottom line, I really like this feature, and it's indicative of something that has some really good engineering involved in it. The next components are strewn out here on the table. This would include the roof sections for the fighting compartment, the transmission compartment, as well as the engine compartment, and of course the engine compartment lids themselves. Obviously they're just painted with primer red, and then everything is weathered with the same format that I used on the remainder of the interior. Here we have the interior portion of the front armor plate, and once it gets into focus you can see the details in better light. On the front plate, we have the detailing for the driver's visor, as well as the co-driver bow machine gun. Both of these details are very nicely rendered out of the box, and again, no mods, in my opinion, are necessary. On the visor over here, this is a clear plastic component that gets mounted in place, which again, it gives you a nice bit of realism on your model, as opposed to going the traditional route where you're going to have to paint the prism with one color or another. On the machine gun, the details are all there, which would include the barrel, the receiver, the optic, as well as also the spent ammunition bag. All of these pieces were painted appropriately and then mounted in place. The kit does, or supposedly has, the ability to have the bow machine gun pivot. However, I found that the tolerances are so tight and the plastic on some of the retention tabs are so narrow and tiny that it doesn't really work in practice. So realistically, it's the type of thing you're going to build, assemble, and set in place, and then just have the piece stay in that location. To further enhance the model, the only thing I did was I went ahead and painted the grips to look like redwood or bakelite, both of which were common on weapon grips of the period. And on the optic here, there is a small little rubber eye cup that's integrally molded in, and I just painted it slightly different and add a little swipe of gloss lacquer here on the lens portion to again give a little bit more highlighting and a little bit more pop to this bit of detailing. The canvas bag, just painted it with the type of canvas coloring that would be present on German vehicles of the era, and then I just weathered it accordingly. On top of the other front detailing, the kit also supplies you with a section of ammunition belt. The ammo belt is painted, as you can see right now, is ready for installation. This will be done shortly before everything gets fitted in place. The ammo belt is painted accordingly. You have the shells themselves painted in brass, the projectiles painted in copper, and the belt is painted in a silver type coloring. What's important to point out is that on this pattern of vehicle, the belt was a disintegrating link, and the links that were used on this pattern of machine gun were aluminum or silver in coloring. This differs, of course, from the American machine guns, which had that black oxide phosphate finish on them. So if you're rendering one of these models, you want to go with the silver route for the ammunition belt, as opposed to using a swipe of black paint. On the rear engine compartment panels, we have here the roof section. This does fit in place, however, I found it that you need to make a slight modification to this little section over here, because if you try to mount it out of the box, from my experience, it makes contact with the radiator and it inhibits the piece from being mounted appropriately. So with that small little bit of fine tuning was all that was needed, and then the piece just drops directly in without any other issues. On the engine hatches, these are very nicely detailed, and you do have an option between the two variants, between the early and the later pattern, and I just followed the kit's recommendations, and that's the version that I went with. One thing that's really cool is this bottom portion here. We have a little piece of grating which is made from photo etch, and again, it's a very nice bit of detailing, and once it's installed, it really does give the model a little bit more of a polished look. All these details, of course, are supplied with the kit. On the bow roof section, we have here a separate molded hatch for the transmission. This is another nice little bit of detailing. Specifically, if you're building your model for a diorama, you can have it in the open state, displaying the nice interior detailing found in the transmission. However, my build, the model is going to be buttoned up, so having this piece in the open position is not going to be possible, so I just glued it in the closed position that you see here. Again, it is something I just wanted to mention, specifically while the model was at this point of the construction. Moving to the roof, you'll notice that the piece is a very simple bit of tooling, nothing really too much to talk about, with the exception that the turret does not have any sort of lock system that's present on this piece here. The turret is held in place via friction and friction alone. One thing I do want to touch upon, though, is that when it came time to fitting on the turret to the roof, I found that the tolerances were a bit on the tight end. So tight, in fact, that if I tried to just squeeze it in place, I could have possibly broke something. I'm not sure if this has to do with the amount of plastic found in this piece, or if it's just a byproduct from the layers of paint built up on both the turret ring as well as on the roof itself. Either way, in order to solve this with a Dremel with a used sanding drum, I actually went ahead and just carefully removed some material around this portion over here. Again, I have to stress the word carefully, and a very slight amount of material, because if you remove too much material around this piece here, you run the risk of the turret not fitting on properly, and it can just lead to some issues. Once the right amount of material is removed, the piece will just slide directly in place like you see, and as you can see, the friction is enough to keep everything in place without it having falling out loose. And of course, this leads us now to the turret interior. The turret interior consists of the gun as well as the magazines. The magazines are found here on the rear bustle portion, and as you can see, there are quite a few of these ammunition sections that are mounted. All of the locations are mounted out of box. However, just like with the hull, the indications that are molded into the bustle over here are more or less suggestions, and this is something that is going to have to be carefully done by the builder. Outside of the magazines, by the way, there's also another magazine right there on the roof of the turret. Just wanted to point that out. And aside from that quick little deviation, takes to the remainder of the turret interior, which consists of the front plate here that contains the coax machine gun as well as also the main gun. The main gun itself is decently rendered, although I will say that the breech detailing is very, very amorphous. In fact, I'll argue that there's really no breech detailing at all whatsoever on this model, which can be construed as a ding on the kit. Fortunately, it's in a location that's not really visible at all, but it is something I did want to touch upon, and perhaps if someone's building this kit and want to take it to the next level, maybe you want to focus on spicing up a little bit the breech area on this build. The piece does have the canvas bag that's molded into this area over here, and just like with the machine gun bags, I painted and weathered them in a similar format. The remainder of the system is really simple to put together. The whole section is in halves, then you have 2 or 3 small little pieces that glued on, completing everything that you see here. One nice feature that the gun system does have is that it is in line with the optic, and since the optic connects to it, the whole unit will elevate and depress in unison, which you can see right there. It's a very nice feature that this kit does have. Then, for the coaxial machine gun, I'm not sure you can even call it a coaxial machine gun because it is not connected in any way, shape, or form to the main gun, and it's purely independent. Just like with the one on the front, it utilizes basically the exact same components as well as the same machine gun detailing. And again, it was just basically rendered, painted, and assembled in the exact same format. Also, just like with the one on the front, the one here on the turret is non-functional from what I've seen. So again, type of thing where you want to set the height and the orientation of the machine gun, and then once it's in place, you're not going to be messing around with it from that point onward. Then, of course, we have the 2 seats that we have here. These are basic pieces that are supplied with the kit, nicely detailed and rendered, and were assembled as is. The other thing I want to mention involves the commander's cupola. The interior detailing is pretty decently rendered. We have a nice little pad on the top portion of the hatch there, as well as some periscopes, which are definitely not going to be visible now that everything is assembled. However, just like with the other periscopes on this model, the prisms are actually clear plastic, which is a nice little detailing that the kit, of course, does have. The piece goes together fairly easily. The box here on the front required a little bit more hand fitting. There's this little section that's molded in, and it's a key notch system so that this box, once assembled, can just lock into place, and it's good to go. The piece does have a piece of clear plastic on this portion as well. However, I found that that molded in section of opaque plastic is slightly too large and interferes with the prism once mounted in place. To secure it to the model, I basically just polished away that lump of plastic altogether, and then once everything was removed, everything fit in place in a much smoother format. Then once all assembled, the cupola just dropped directly onto the model as you see here. Starting with the model's running gear, outside of the tracks, the remainder of what you see here is supplied with the kit. The pieces are very nicely detailed with the way they are rendered, and with the way they assemble, it's also done in a fairly quick manner. Although I do want to point out that many of the components are a bit on the frailer end, so you do want to exhibit care when going through the removal and cleaning process. Also, I do want to point out that the pieces are finite in that if you have the misfortune of losing a small little piece here or there, you're going to be pretty much screwed because the kit does not give you any spares. There's a ton of other spare parts, but some of the spares that would have been nice would have been a few other pieces for the suspension. But again, if you take your time and are very careful about it, you should fare pretty well. One other thing I do want to touch upon is that the way the kit is designed, the swing arms are able to pivot. However, this feature is really lost once you continue with the assembly. Unlike several other vehicle types out there that have a fully form-fitting suspension. With the way the 38T suspension is designed, you have these leaf springs that are found behind the wheels, and because of that, you're not going to be able to have the pieces form-fit because the leaf springs need to be permanently attached to the hull in a certain manner. I believe what Dragon had in mind was that if you were going to model this vehicle to fit on a diorama base of one type of terrain or another, you can custom fit it during the assembly point, and then you can glue the suspension to that type of a setup. However, if you're just building the model like I am with just standard flat terrain type display, you just want to build it in the manner that we see here. The suspension does go together pretty easily in that regard, and there's no other weird type of configuration that you need to accomplish in order to get the model to just sit on the wheels like the way you see it in the video. As I touched upon earlier in the video, the kit supplies you with what Dragon likes to call magic tracks, which is nothing more than individual link-and-link tracks under a different name. There's literally nothing magic about those tracks. So, just like on all the other builds that are cursed with indie link tracks, I went ahead and promptly replaced them with a set of workable tracks. The tracks that are on this model here are made from Master Club. The Master Club tracks are excellent in just about any regard. The tracks are very nicely detailed. The scale's pretty good. The material that they're made of is metal, so they're similar in many respects to the metal tracks from Fruley model, although unlike the Fruleys where the hinging is done via a length of wire, for the Master Club links here, they supply you with a set of cast resin links. The links went together pretty well, however, I didn't use any of the resin pins because with the small scale that the pins are molded in, I found it a bit difficult with getting them into their appropriate locations. Unfortunately, I didn't make a video about the assembly of the tracks themselves like I've been doing on more recent builds. However, I do have another Dragon Smart Kit in the stash that is a 38T pattern. It's actually basically the same chassis as this one over here with the interior and everything, and I do have another set of the Master Club links, the same exact patterns that are found on this build. When I get to that build, I will be doing a thorough tutorial on how the tracks go together, as well as a review on the tracks in general, but that's really something best left up for another video for another day. On this model over here, the tracks, even though I went ahead and replaced the cast resin pins with my own metal pins, they still went together very, very easily. Once assembled, the tracks line up and time extremely well, if not perfectly, with the kit supplied sprocket. And once you have the tension adjusted, the tracks will do anything that you expect of them. One thing that's nice is that the tracks are made out of metal, so you do have some nice natural sag going on in the appropriate locations. And with the tracks being metal, they do have some nice weight to the model, which makes it settle down better on the terrain that it is placed on. Although, again, even though it doesn't have a functional suspension, is just something about having a nice weighted down model that overall just makes it just seem all that higher quality. Of course, by adding these tracks here to your model, the cost does go up considerably because the tracks are probably almost as much as the model itself. Having said that, they are absolutely worth it and arguably required because, as I generally state, the individual link-and-link tracks are crap, and you can never go wrong with replacing them with a set of workables from one flavor or another. Definitely one that's made out of metal. On that note, I believe that the metal alloy used on the Master Club ones are similar to the ones found on Fruley, which means that the metal may be a lead-based alloy. Because of this, you do want to take the proper safety precautions when working with these tracks. Namely, wash your hands, your tools, and your work area where you assemble and handle these tracks. And on top of that, you want to, at all costs, keep them away from small children. Once the tracks are fully painted and fitted on the model, however, they become much more safer to handle, like you see here. The tracks are, of course, painted with my usual manner with the use of a very dark gray, or it's almost a black type spray paint. Because the tracks are metal, they are immune to some of the harsher paints that are out there that are generally found in some of the dark gray primers that are on the market. And the scratch surface you see here is done via dry brushing. So the metal material of the tracks are completely encased and are no longer out and exposed to the environment. And that wraps up the suspension, so let's move along to the remainder of the vehicle's details. Starting with the front area over here, all of the details, or I should say the remainder details on this model, are stocked with the Dragon kit, and For good reason, the Dragon kit is excellent with the overall detailing. So here we have some of the lights found on the tin work. These are, of course, the kit supply ones, and in order to just enhance them, just a swipe of the appropriate paint was utilized. Because they are a white light, a small little drop of silver paint was used to replicate this. The MG, as we saw before, was painted on the inside, but of course, the remainder of the barrel section was painted and weathered to the configuration that we have here. When you're weathering and painting this pattern of MG, you want to be careful because on the 38T there is this little guard that wraps around this section here of the barrel assembly. So trying to get in here with the paint and the weathering is something that's a bit tricky, but not impossible. This was painted via a paintbrush, and if you're careful enough, you should be able to get the paint in the appropriate location without there being any collateral damage. Moving towards the driver's side over here, you can see the remainder of the tin work details, which would include a bunch of Pioneer tools. The tools are nicely rendered, however, the tools are a bit complicated because they do feature photo etch in order just to flesh them out in the manner that we have here. The photo etch for these sections are very, very frail, and you do have to take caution with the removal, the bending, and the assembly. Once everything goes into their appropriate locations, though, the build does flesh out pretty well. In addition to the PE used for the straps, there's this plate that we have right here on the side. That's an iconic bit of detailing found on the 38T family. And this piece here was, of course, made from photo etch and was simply mounted out of the box. Moving to the opposite side, you can see the remainder of the Pioneer tools. And just like with the ones on the reverse side, they do feature very small pieces of photo etch which are used for the tie-down straps. Again, a lot of caution needs to be exhibited by the builder during this part of the build. On the jack, this is the kit supplied unit. It is nicely rendered, but again, the PE will again be used for the strap work. While on this area, you can see the perforated box, which is a really, really eye-catching bit of detailing for the 38T family. The kit does give you two options. You can roll with a injection molded plastic version, or you can go ahead and play hard mode again and use one made from bent photo etch. For this build here, I went with the path of least resistance and used the plastic one, and honestly the plastic unit is excellent. It's robust, it's appropriately sized and detailed, and what's awesome about it is that all the perforations are molded hollow. The only reason why you would want to use the brass one is if you want to really build this one on hard mode, or you want to model it where the piece is dinged up, damaged in one shape or another, to which then the metal one might be a better fit. For me, however, the stock plastic one is an excellent choice and was simply utilized out of box. At the very rear of the tin work, we do have a length of spare track, and these, I believe, are the individual Lincoln length or magic tracks that are supplied with the kit. 3 links are simply plugged together, and then the strap work is again facilitated with the PE that I've mentioned before. On the remainder of the rear details, you do have several options out there with the way the kit is rendered. Some features are optional, and others are ones that you have to make some tweaks to in order to fit it onto the rear. The instructions do illustrate this quite well, but it's one of those things where you can get lost in the instructions because there is a ton of stuff going on back here and you just see little lines pointing everywhere. So you do want to take your time reading the instructions because you may miss something with the way they are laid out. Having said that, however, the instructions themselves are pretty clear and concise, albeit just a bit noisy in certain locations. But if you take your time, you should be able to successfully outfit this area of the build. Here we have, again, some PE for that little blade system that I touched upon on the side. If I'm not mistaken, I think it might be for a unit marking or some sort, but the way you see it on the model is, again, built out of the box. On the top portion, you have that grill work, which I mentioned earlier in the video, and the grill work is excellent. It's a nice bit of detailing. It folds very well, and it just gives you a lot of nice detailing on the rear section here of this build. The exhaust manifold is also nicely done. It is a 2-part assembly, which means there is some basic seam work to contend with. Polishes away pretty easily, and once done, it leads for a nice result that you see here. On the remainder of the tin work, we have some of the rear lights. We have 2 red lights and then 2 of the convoy lights. This one here, the little squares are painted with their green color, which is appropriate for the rear light in this manner. And the other one here has the two lenses painted with appropriate colors, which is red on top and orange on the bottom. As I often state in these videos, one easy way to enhance the build is to simply just paint your lenses. There are a lot of models I've seen built there on the internet, and this is something where a lot of people fall short. Either I guess they don't realize it's a taillight, or they paint them improperly. The taillights and the reflectors are really easy to paint, and once you have the right colors where they need to go, it just makes the build look that much more complete. Moving on down takes to the tow hitch. Generally, this isn't something that's all that important, but on this build here, obviously it's a bit of a different story. What's unique is that the model gives you 3 ways to render this bit of detailing. The first is to just have the tow hitch completely open without the top clasp installed, and the other 2 options are with 2 different types of top clasps. One of them is made out of plastic, and the other is made out of photo etch. The photo etch piece is actually quite interesting because it's a flat piece that gets folded to the shape of a channel, and then it gets popped into this spot over here. For this build, I went with the plastic one because, well, it's the easier one to work with. Not only is the piece stronger and more robust because of how thick it is, but for this one it's super important because you need that strength due to the weight here of the trailer on the end of the hitch. The clasp itself, even the plastic one, is a bit on the frailer end, but it goes on without any problems or needs for hand fitting. The photo etch one, if you want to roll with that, you're braver than I am, but again, it is an option that the kit does give you. Moving to the very rear of the model takes us to the start of the show, which is really the fuel trailer. The trailer goes together very easily, and it is nicely detailed, and even the trailer itself has photo etch that is necessary. The fuel drum gets assembled, and once it's built, it gets fitted to the trailer, and then it's strapped in place via these 2 straps that we have here. The straps are made out of photo etch, and they do have a elaborate little buckle system that is all separately rendered in PE that you, the builder, are going to have to bend and contort and magically try to fit to the model over here. It is doable, but again, it's one of those things that you really have to take a lot of care during the assembly with. The remainder of the trailer's detailing is really good out of the box. We have here a set of SDK Z250 type road wheels, which look really good and are nicely rendered. The remainder of the detailing found on the oil drum is nicely rendered as well. You can see the embossed detailing found on the front portion as well as on the rear portion of the oil drum. The little filler spout is there with all of its appropriate detailing, and the center cap detailing is also nicely rendered. What's interesting is that the Dragon kit gives you the little spigot that plugs into this section over here, but also with the type of material they use for the fuel tube. On the kit here, like I touched upon earlier, the kit supplies you with a length of string for this, which is an interesting type of material choice because, like I stated earlier, a length of rubber tube may have also been used in its place. However, I'm not really sure if the Germans would have used a rubber tube for this type of setup, or if they would use a braided type tube like you see here. Of course, braided tubes were in existence back then, so using this material is something that's not very far-fetched at all. The choice of the string is interesting because one, it gives you some nice texture detailing that's, found on the micro weave found on the string, but also the tube, or in this case, I should say the string, is nice and pliable, which is great because you really get to bend and shape it to the form that we have here, and it stays its shape more or less. One thing to watch out for is with the way the string connects to the spigot, it's not like, again, if it was a tube, we could just like plug into it. Instead, you have to carefully super glue one end of the string when cut clean to the top portion here of the spigot. This is something that may be difficult to do and might take a attempt or 2 in order to facilitate. But once you get the piece in place, it looks really good. On the model over here, in order to get the tube into place, you actually have to drill this section out with a pin vise, and then the tube just simply unceremoniously plugs into this section, and that's where it ends. Which is also interesting to point out because, like I said before, this tank does have full interior detailing, so if you open up the engine grate and just have a tube just aimlessly sticking into the model without anything plugged into, it is something that could potentially hurt the look. But obviously, if you're building this model and you want to render it with the hatches open, you can easily go ahead and configure the tube to plug or connect into the gas tank, which of course I believe it would plug into during the usage of this. Moving our way to the turret, there's nothing really much to talk about over here. The turret is all stock with the out-of-the-box details and goes together very, very well, and, it's just a nicely engineered piece overall. You really get to appreciate all of the little rivet detailing that's present on the piece, as well as also the other small micro details that were incorporated by Dragon. On the bow, or I should say on the turret MG, it's the same type of thing, like I mentioned before, with the bow MG. So when you're painting it, you do want to be very careful not to get any collateral damage with the paint getting accidentally brushstroked onto the areas where it doesn't need to be. One interesting feature found with the vehicle is an option with this device that we have right here on the turret. I went with, obviously, the version that we have here. And one thing I do want to point out is that the section that's in the center area is actually a canvas piece on the real vehicle. So I went ahead and painted and weathered it in that type of format. On a similar note, you can see it back here on the front, the antenna base. And the antenna base detailing is the stock setup, but of course an antenna is going to be required. The antenna wire itself is just a thin piece of floor wire, which was simply added to the appropriate location. And like I always mention on these builds, the German World War II antenna bases have the bottom portion in rubber, a middle portion would be brass, and then the remainder of the antenna wire itself would be black in color. Jumping back to the cupola, and this is also true for several of the other periscopes on this model, but as I touched upon before, these are rendered with clear plastic, which is a nice bit of detailing. However, it does lend itself for a bit of a complication during painting. You can try to mask these areas up for painting, but it becomes a bit problematic to the point where it's easier just to remove the paint after it's been applied. The paint was removed via a paintbrush with some paint thinner, where I added to just these locations over here, and then once the paint dissolves, I just clean it up and it'll expose the clear plastic underneath. This is interesting to point out because the model is painted with exterior latex, but the paint thinner doesn't go after this paint, it actually goes and attacks the primer that's underneath. As I often mention, I use flat black spray paint for that. Flat black is something that is affected by paint thinner, so after letting the paint thinner soak in there, it will dislodge the paint from underneath, and then you could just clean it up with a few swipes with the paintbrush. It'll take a few attempts to do, but once the momentum gets rolling with the paint dissolving, it does clean up pretty easily and mostly effortlessly. Of course, as we know, the model does have the full interior detailing, and that interior detailing is not lost because even though the model is fully buttoned up, I did not glue on the two rear hatches, as well as you get plenty of access into viewing the interior with the turret removed. One thing I do want to mention with the interior was, again, with the battery tray. As we saw before, the model has a photo etch metal tray that gets fitted into this location over here to protect the battery detailing underneath. At this point here, you can see what it looks like with the battery tray lid fitted in place, but one thing I do want to point out is that I did not glue this in place. In fact, it is fully removable. Although I'm not going to go ahead and remove it at this time in the video, but be aware, this piece here, if I touch it with the stick here, you can see is movable, which is great. So if for whatever reason I want to get access to those batteries underneath, I can simply just pop the piece off and you'll have full access to that detailing as well. Also, now with the model fully complete, you really get to appreciate the detailing that's applied with this kit, and you can really see how nicely detailed and well engineered this kit really is. One other thing I want to mention at this time is that with the turret removed, you get to see the MG found here on the bow like I touched upon before. Also, like I touched upon before, the kit does give you a nice little detailed ammo belt for that detailing. Well, here you get to see what it looks like with the belt fitted in place. The belt itself is made out of a very thin piece of plastic, but it is fairly pliable. Not pliable to the point where you could bend it over and over again. Eventually it will snap, but you can get a few bends out of it in order to get it to the look that you see here. If you're fitting in place, you do want to have some articulation rendered into it because it just makes it look that much more realistic. The belt is cut in half so that half of the belt is hooked up to the one there on the bow, and the second one is right there on this portion here of the one found in the turret. the belt just gets glued in place, and once added, it really does give a nice little bit of detailing to the model overall. If you are rendering this model with the bow hatch in the open position, you will obviously get to appreciate this detailing even more, and this is great if you're working with a diorama type setting. This is something that would definitely be appreciated in that type of format. With the model back in one piece, it's now time to go over the paint and the markings. For the model's paintwork, I went with an overall Panzer Gray finish, which of course for this vehicle here is more than appropriate. The weathering is done in my usual format, which would include the use of counter shading, washes, and fading. And of course, a little bit of dry brushing is done for good measure to highlight all of those nice edges, which this vehicle here is prolific with. The markings on this model are the kit supplied water slide decals, and you do have a few options available for markings. For this build, I went with the one with the yellow 9 because it just looked really striking from the box art and also from the color plate that I had in the instruction sheet, so I simply just went with this rendition. The markings are excellent with their quality. The water slide decals that are supplied with the Dragon kits are pretty good overall, and they went on without any sort of problems. Once they were applied, of course, the entire model was sealed off with VMS matte varnish, giving you the appearance that we have here. One other thing to mention is after the matte varnish was added, I then went ahead and added the oil staining or the oil drips that you see here on several of the road wheels. This is a common trick that I do on my builds because these bearings really do wear out quite quickly on these vehicles, and it's not uncommon to see a vehicle in this type of configuration in the flesh. When you are going with this type of a weathering, of course, you do want to be careful not making all of the wheels look the same, because this is something that can actually hurt the look of the build as opposed to helping it. By varying the weathering or even the amount of weathering on these sections, it's a way to give a little bit extra character to your build, making the model a bit more interesting compared to just leaving everything clean. However, if you do want to leave the drips off, that's also something that is appropriate, but again, it's just another tool to have in your weathering toolbox. One last thing that I want to mention involves handling of the model. This one here is very different compared to most other models out there because of the articulating nature of the trailer. The trailer is on in a permanent manner. It's not something that you can simply unplug and plug on at the earliest convenience. Because of that, you have to take extra care when handling this thing, because you can potentially damage the model or the trailer with the use of improper handling. For example, the weakest link of this entire setup here is the tow hitch, and as I touched upon before, the tow hitch is nicely detailed, but it's also very frail and fragile. Because of that, you do want to be very careful with the handling. If anything were to happen to that, it's going to cause some unneeded complications with your model. The best way to handle this is with a 2-point of contact type setup. With each hand, I pick the tank and the trailer up, and I try to keep it as straight as possible to prevent any sort of damage happening to any of the features on the model, the trailer, or importantly, the tow hitch. This is the type of thing that you want to set on a plaque or some sort of a static type location and don't really mess with it. For this model here, of course, it's going to be going in my collection, and when it does enter my collection, it's going to be housed in a clear plastic box like we see here and like I've touched upon in a few of the other videos. What's great is that not only does the box keep the model dust-proof, which is fantastic, but because it is self-contained like that, it will prevent the model from moving around and causing unneeded damage to any of the locations that I just mentioned. Again, this is one of those things that you really don't think about until you actually have one of these completed and in your collection, and then at that point there you'll quickly notice that you do need to come up with some sort of solution, because you can break things if not. And there we go. The model fits absolutely perfectly in this little box here. If the barrel was just a little bit longer, it would have been a little bit more of a problem, but luckily the 38T, that's not an issue. And not only is this thing dust-proof, but as you can see, I can move this thing with the model being in one piece, so any sort of potential damage to the trailer or the model itself is basically minimized, if not non-existent. In the end, I'm really happy in how this build turned out. My collection was always missing a 38T in a pure tank form. I've done a few versions of the Hetzer and the Martyr in the past, but A 38T was just one of those vehicles that eluded my collection, so having this particular example added to the collection, it's one that really does feel pretty good. And the fact that the 38T that broke the ice in my negated 38T collection is not just a standard garden variety version, but it's a really cool variant, of course, being with the extended range trailer. Which is a perfect point to pivot us into skill level and recommendation. First, right off the bat, this is a super kit. Whenever I throw that term around, this is exactly the type of model that I am referring to. This model here is definitely not going to be recommended for beginners and even intermediate builders. This model here is definitely one that's basically by and large meant for someone who's an advanced model builder. Looks are most definitely deceiving because the 38T doesn't seem to be that difficult of a vehicle as a whole. However, with the way Dragon executed this model and with the features that it has, there is no way a beginner or even an intermediate can tackle one of these builds. If we can recall, the thing does have a full interior detailing, which already adds complexity to the model, which definitely throws it out of the realm of someone who's never touched a plastic model for the first time, or maybe built one or two simplistic builds. And with the way the model uses photo etch, this is definitely something outside of an intermediate builder whose main experience with photo etch might be, cutting the meshwork off of a fret and putting them on the back of a Tiger One or a King Tiger. If that's your idea of working with photo etch, this kit here is definitely going to be jumping into the deep end of the swimming pool. As we can recall, there's some features that are supplied with this kit that I myself noped out of when I had the opportunity to do so at the first chance. Some of these pieces are optional, however, some other components are mandatory, and those are the things that you are going to have to undertake in order to just get the model built to the basic out-of-the-box configuration. So again, this thing here, it's really best left for someone who is an advanced builder. On top of that, I cannot recommend enough the replacement of the tracks. The model does come with the so-called magic tracks, which is nothing more than individual link and length under a different name. And it would really behoove whoever is building one of these models or any of the other 38T smart kits from Dragon to simply swap them out with a nice set of workables. The Master Club sets were the ones that I used on this particular build, and they are excellent, which really streamline the build, making it easier compared to just going with the out-of-the-box configuration. Again, in my opinion, the addition of the aftermarket tracks are absolutely mandatory on this build. If, however, you are a person watching this and you do have the required skill sets in order to put one of these together, do not hesitate on getting one of these kits. They are excellent. The model is a nice, beautiful rendition of the 38T. The details are exquisite. The fact that it gives you full interior makes it even cooler, and the addition of the fuel trailer is just basically sprinkles on top of this ice cream sundae. If you are watching this video and are still interested in a 38T, however, this kit is something that's outside of your skill set, there are several other renditions of a 38T on the market. One of the oldest options is from Italeri, and that one, if found, it makes for a pretty decent kit, although it is going to be much simplistic compared to this one over here due to the age of the tooling. However, in my opinion, that kit still holds up pretty well. There are a few other 38T renditions from Dragon, and I'm pretty sure there's a few others out there that are eluding me at the moment that are far easier compared to this example here. Of course, with those, chances are highly likely you are going to have to swap out the track because it seems like the vast majority of the 38Ts that are currently on the market do feature individual link and link track, and as I've just stated, that's something that's never beneficial on any build. Of course, for recommendations, I can't recommend this kit enough for anyone who's an avid fan of German World War II armor or just World War II tanks in general. If you're a fan of what I like to call the German Zoo, the 38T here is an excellent addition to add to your collection. This kit here I would also recommend for anyone who's into making dioramas because of the feature of the full interior, as well as also with the fuel trailer here. This would lend itself for depicting this model in some very interesting scenes. Another person who would be a no-brainer for this kit here would be anyone who's a fan of the Czech pattern 38T, or just, again, Czech tanks in general. 38T has a very rich history, and this particular unit here was rendered in a very excellent manner. There are lots of options out there for 38Ts on the market, as I touched upon earlier, and by adding this one to your collection, it's definitely one that will improve and fulfill the collection even more. And with that, that wraps up this model showcase video for the 1/35th scale Panzer 38T ausf.S with the single drum fuel trailer. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being 1/35th scale model showcase videos like this one over here, or the other larger scale project update videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in loop with new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There I have more photographs of this particular build, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been seen on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detailed components. Thanks again, and I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. Take care.